Hello, my name is Josh Higgins, and I'm going to show you how I built this modern style barn door today. I'm going to show you some tricks, some tips, and some ways that you might be able to tackle this project in your own home. The materials I'm using for this door are 1/2-inch plywood, which you see me here cutting in half. And I'm also going to be using MDF. MDF is going to be the core of this door. The reason why I'm using MDF is because it's a nice solid piece of compact wood that's been cut by the factory and has nice straight edges, and I know that I can trust that it's going to stay nice and straight and won't allow any bowing to happen with these pieces of plywood. The plywood is 1/2 inch thick, which makes it easy to kind of adjust and manipulate as we make the door. And you can see here, I'm going to cut this piece of plywood in half to make it easier to cut on the table saw. Here I'm using my bench top, and I'm using a contractor saw. Now the reason why I'm telling you about a contractor saw is because you don't need a fancy cabinet, big table saw. You could even do this with a small circular saw as you saw in the last video. Here I'm cutting slats. These slats are 4 inches thick by 8 feet long. These are the plywood that you saw that I cut down in the last video in half, and makes it easier for me to cut on my table saw. The reason why I'm using these 4-inch slats is because they're an easier way, and plus a little bit of a cheaper way than buying these pre-made. Now if you can and you want to, you can buy pre-made slats cut to 4 inches, 3 inches, 2 inches, any width of your desire, and also length. They just cost a little bit more. And they're sometimes usually made out of not this plywood, but made out of a hardwood like poplar or maple, or possibly walnut if you want to get a little bit crazy.
Evolutionary process going on, but mankind won't be destroyed. The fact that you and I are working here today is evidence of that.
After cutting the slats, I needed to mark the center of my door. The center of the door is 4 feet because this is a full 8-foot size door. I use my carpenter square and a straight edge, or a straight ruler. This is a yardstick, a metal yardstick that has a straight edge on the end. To get a complete straight edge right off the edge of the MDF door, which is going to be my core, I put my carpenter square next to it, clamped it down, and that gave me a full length. By using the straight edge, I get a nice straight line from one edge of the door to the other edge of the door, allowing me to place my slats exactly where they need to be on that center line. Here I'm going to cut my slats on the miter saw. You notice my miter saw is cut at an angle. That angle is at 45 degrees. Once you have those 45-degree angles, we'll put them back on the table, and using a brad nailer, we'll brad nail these slats onto the MDF. So here I'm using my Milwaukee 18-gauge brad nailer. I'm also using my square put at the 45-degree mark, which is the opposite side of that straight edge. And I put it along the MDF because I know that's straight. This allows that first board to be completely straight and at that diagonal mark. And you can see I'm test fitting on each side. Once I've got the first board down, I know that I can use all the scraps from the other pieces. So the key here, and the key when building a project, is make sure that you don't have a lot of waste. So even though I might be cutting a board in half or cutting a board off to the side, I'm still using my extra slat pieces to cut smaller slats and smaller pieces to go on my door. The less waste, the more money that you profit in your pocket, and the more that your customer actually has the same piece of wood. Since I was using plywood, I wanted to make sure that I use the same side of the plywood, or the same piece of plywood on each side of the door. Therefore, it would be helpful when staining, and also give that door the exact same style and look on each side. So here you can see I'm placing each slat at the very top of that center line. Once it hits that center line, I take some glue, and I put my slat down. I make sure that it's straight. I'm going to repeat every other or every couple pieces. I will make sure my straight edge is there and mark it down. If you don't have a brad nail, you can use a hammer. Make sure I get a nice. If you do have a pin nailer, that will leave a smaller hole, which will be easier to the door and get that diagonal. My brad nailer is an 18-gauge brad nail, so I'll go back at the end before I put a finish and a stain on and fill those holes. Next, we are going to go up and down the door with our diagonal pieces. We already went side to side with our diagonal. Now we're gonna go ahead and go straight down. Please don't mind the garage door safety string hanging in front. I had to get creative with my tripod to get this overhead view so you could see me placing each slat. I'm repeating the process I did before of glue, brad nails all the way down, making sure I get a nice fit on each piece, and using my carpenter square to make sure each piece is square, so when we get down to the bottom we have a nice even spacing between each slat. Once all the slats are attached on one side, I use my router with a flush trim bit. A flush trim bit has a bearing at the bottom that rides along the MDF and gives me a nice straight cut. And that allows that red piece where the blade is to cut all the way down. The key is going nice and slow and taking your time so you don't split any of the plywood up as you go on down. And yes, it makes a lot of dust. Now, here on my table, I have a completed door. I repeated the process of cutting, gluing, and putting the slats on the opposite side of the door, and then used my router again to trim off the edges. It's the same process. We went diagonally across the door and then back down. Here, I'm using a stain by Minwax called Jacobine. This Jacobine is like a very, very dark walnut looking color, and when I'm applying today is on plywood, and sometimes plywood, it's hard for it to sink in that stain because it might have that veneer on the top that gives it that slick look and hard for it to absorb stain. Easier to absorb paint, but harder to absorb stain. So I use a rag to wipe on the stain and then use another rag to wipe down after the stain is kind of soaked in for a few minutes. I repeated that process on both sides, giving it time to dry, giving it time to cure, and take in that stain. I really like this color Jacobine because it gives that dark walnut color. It's almost a mix between a chocolate color, but also leaves hints of transparency so you can see the grain in the door.
I don't deny there's some strange evolutionary process.
I want to thank you guys for checking out my first YouTube video on how to build this modern style barn door. The customer really enjoyed it and they're going to be planning on installing it after the holidays. Please look at my YouTube channel. I'm going to be putting out a couple more videos. I really enjoy the process of video creating and building, and I hope you enjoyed this video on how to build a modern style barn door.